There's a place in Mississippi where the earth remembers. A massive earthen mound rises from the landscape, ancient and silent, holding secrets that stretch back thousands of years. The Choctaw people call it Naniwaya, the Mother Mound, and according to their oldest stories, this isn't just a monument, it's the birthplace of an entire nation. Imagine emerging from darkness into light, crawling through the belly of the earth itself, following the sound of voices ahead, until finally breaking through into a world of endless sky and possibilities. This is how the Choctaw say they came to be. Not just a creation myth, but a story encoded with meaning, with memory, with the wisdom of countless generations who built civilizations that rivaled anything in ancient Europe. Today, we're going to walk through 3 powerful chapters of Choctaw history and culture. First, we'll explore their ancient origins and the magnificent mound-building civilization they created. Then, we'll discover a language so complex it helped win World War I, and an artistic tradition that turned simple materials into profound statements of identity. And finally, we'll witness one of history's greatest stories of survival, as the Choctaw endured forced removal, systematic oppression, and yet somehow not only survived but are thriving today. This isn't just history. This is the story of a people who built astronomical observatories from Earth, who developed sophisticated governance systems, who sent aid to Ireland during the potato famine even while suffering themselves, and who are now reclaiming their voice in the modern world. The Choctaw journey is epic, heartbreaking, and ultimately triumphant, and it begins in the heart of the earth itself, at a mound called Naniwaya, where everything started. The Choctaw creation story doesn't begin with gods in the clouds or supernatural beings creating humans from clay. It begins underground, in total darkness, where the first people lived in the depths of the earth. They had never seen the sun, never felt wind on their faces, never heard birdsong or watched rivers flow. Their world was the cave, the tunnel, the endless night beneath the world. But there were stories among them, whispers passed from generation to generation, about another place, a place above. Some of the bravest began to explore the tunnels, searching for a way out, following passages that seemed to lead upward. They traveled for what might have been days or years, time having no real meaning in the perpetual darkness. And then one group found it, a narrow passage that climbed steadily upward, towards something they could feel but not yet name. When they finally emerged, crawling out through Naniwaya, the Mother Mound, they were reborn. The sun was almost painful in its brightness. The sky stretched impossibly far in every direction. Colors existed that they had no words for. This was the first emergence, and those who came through became the Choctaw people. Behind them came others, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, each nation emerging in its turn from the sacred mound. But this story is more than just a creation tale. It's a map of consciousness, a philosophical statement about transformation and journey. The darkness represents the unknown, the period before understanding. The climb through the tunnels is the struggle for knowledge. And the emergence into light is enlightenment, awakening, the moment when a people truly becomes itself. Naniwaya isn't just where the Choctaw came from. It's a symbol of every difficult passage, every transformation that defines human experience. The physical mound still exists today in Winston County, Mississippi. It rises nearly 40 feet high and stretches almost a quarter mile around its base. Archaeological evidence suggests it was built around 1700 years ago, though the Choctaw oral tradition places it much earlier. The engineering required to construct it was remarkable. Thousands of tons of earth, carried basket by basket, shaped with precision and purpose. This wasn't random. Every measurement had meaning. Every angle aligned with something celestial. For the Choctaw, Naniwaya remained the spiritual center of their world for millennia. It was the place where ceremonies were held, where leaders were chosen, where people came to connect with their deepest origins. Even today, thousands of miles from Mississippi, Choctaw people speak of the Mother Mound with reverence. It's not just history, it's identity. It's the answer to the question every culture must ask: where do we come from? Naniwaya wasn't alone. Across the southeastern United States, the ancestors of the Choctaw and related peoples built hundreds of earthen mounds, creating what archaeologists now call the Mississippian culture. These weren't simple burial mounds or random piles of dirt. They were sophisticated architectural achievements, some rivaling the pyramids of Mesoamerica in scale and precision. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was a city of perhaps 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 CE, making it larger than London at the same time. The Choctaw were part of this vast network of mound-building cultures, connected through trade routes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. Copper from Michigan, shells from Florida, obsidian from the Rockies, all flowed through these networks. The mounds served multiple purposes. Some were platforms for temples and elite residences. Others were burial sites for leaders and ancestors. Many aligned precisely with solar and lunar events, functioning as astronomical observatories. Think about what this required. No written mathematical formulas, yet they calculated angles and alignments with precision. No metal tools, yet they moved millions of cubic feet of earth. No centralized authoritarian state forcing labor, yet they coordinated the work of thousands. The social organization necessary for this kind of construction tells us something profound about Choctaw ancestors. They had governance systems sophisticated enough to plan and execute multi-generational projects. They had spiritual beliefs compelling enough to motivate that kind of collective effort. The ceremonial centers built around these mounds weren't just religious sites. They were the focal points of entire civilizations. Imagine approaching one of these complexes in its prime. Plazas surrounded by earthen pyramids, some with wooden temples at their summits, smoke rising from sacred fires. Thousands of people gathered for ceremonies, for trade, for political councils. The sound of drums and singing carrying across the landscape. This was urban planning on a grand scale, creating spaces that served practical, spiritual, and social purposes all at once. What's remarkable is that these mound-building traditions continued right up until European contact and beyond. When Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto traveled through Choctaw territory in the 1540s, they encountered thriving towns organized around mounds, with complex political structures and extensive agricultural systems. The decline of some mound centers predated European arrival, possibly due to climate change or political reorganization, but the culture itself remained vibrant and adaptive. The engineering knowledge embedded in these mounds was extraordinary. They understood soil composition, knowing which types would compact well and which would drain properly. They engineered slopes that would resist erosion for centuries. They created internal structures, chambers and passages that served specific purposes. Some mounds had internal fires that burned continuously for generations, the heat and smoke integral to their ceremonial function. This wasn't primitive technology. It was sophisticated engineering adapted perfectly to available materials and environmental conditions. The astronomical alignments were perhaps most impressive. Certain mounds marked the summer and winter solstices, others tracked the lunar cycle. Still others pointed toward specific star clusters that held cultural significance. This wasn't just stargazing. This was a civilization that understood celestial mechanics well enough to encode them in permanent monuments. The mounds were calendars, timepieces, and spiritual gateways all at once. They connected the earth to the sky, the present to the past, the human to the divine. The Choctaw worldview was built on a three-tiered cosmos. The upper world was the realm of order, predictability, and the sun. The lower world was chaos, transformation, and mystery. And the middle world, where humans lived, was the place where these forces interacted, where balance had to be constantly maintained. This wasn't a battle between good and evil. Both upper and lower worlds were necessary. Life existed in the tension between them. in the creative friction of opposing forces. Animals weren't just resources or creatures to be hunted. They were peoples in their own right, with their own societies, their own wisdom, their own spiritual power. The deer people were known for their grace and awareness, the bear people for their strength and healing knowledge, the snake people for their connection to transformation and the lower world. When a Choctaw hunter took a deer, it wasn't simply killing an animal. It was engaging in a relationship, one that required respect, ritual, and reciprocity. The clan system organized Choctaw society, and these clans were named after animals and natural phenomena. The Imaclasha, the Wind Clan, the Cushapokla, the Cedar Clan. Each clan had specific responsibilities, specific knowledge, specific roles in the larger social fabric. You were born into your mother's clan, and that affiliation shaped your identity, your marriage possibilities, your place in ceremonial life. This wasn't just social organization. It was a way of distributing knowledge and responsibility across the entire community. Storytelling was how all of this knowledge was preserved and transmitted. There were no written texts, but the oral tradition was far from informal or unreliable. Specific individuals trained for years to memorize stories with perfect accuracy, to preserve not just the words but the cadence, the emphasis, the pauses that gave them meaning. Creation stories, historical accounts, moral teachings, practical knowledge about plants and animals, all of it encoded in narratives that could be remembered and passed down through generations. Some stories were sacred, told only at certain times of year or by certain individuals. Others were teaching stories, meant for children to understand proper behavior and social values. Still others were entertainment, tales of tricksters and heroes that also carried deeper wisdom for those ready to perceive it. The oral tradition wasn't one-dimensional. It operated on multiple levels simultaneously, accessible to different audiences in different ways, much like the best literature in any culture. The spiritual leaders, the Alikchi, were healers, counselors, and keepers of sacred knowledge. Their training was extensive, often beginning in childhood and continuing throughout life. They learned the properties of hundreds of plants, the meanings of dreams, the patterns that revealed future events. They understood that illness wasn't just physical, but could be spiritual or social as well. Healing meant restoring balance, addressing not just symptoms but causes, treating the whole person within their community context. Dreams held particular significance in Choctaw spiritual life. They weren't random firings of the sleeping brain, but messages, visions, visits from spirits or ancestors. Certain dreams required specific responses. Some meant you needed to perform a ceremony, others that you should avoid certain actions or seek guidance from an elder. The dream world and waking world weren't separate realities, but different aspects of a single, continuous existence. What happened in dreams could be as real and consequential as what happened while awake. Let's step into a typical Choctaw village as it might have existed 500 years ago, before European contact transformed everything. The village sits near a river, providing water, transportation, and rich bottomland for agriculture. Houses are arranged in a loose pattern around a central plaza where the chunky stone court and the stickball field occupy prominent positions. Each house is a winter dwelling and a summer dwelling, the winter one enclosed and small for warmth, the summer one open and airy. The agricultural cycle governed much of life's rhythm. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were planted together in a symbiotic relationship that indigenous farmers had perfected over millennia. The corn stalks provided poles for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the corn and squash. The squash leaves shaded the ground, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. This wasn't just farming. It was an ecological system, sustainable and regenerative, capable of feeding communities for generations without depleting the soil. Women were the primary farmers, and they controlled the agricultural products. This wasn't a minor detail. In a society where food was wealth, Women's control over agriculture translated into economic and political power. The fields belonged to women, passed down through female lines. Men hunted, fished, waged war when necessary, and participated in governance, but the fundamental economic foundation of Choctaw life rested on women's agricultural knowledge and labor. The seasonal round included much more than just planting and harvesting. Spring meant fishing when the rivers ran high with spawning fish. Summer brought berry gathering, hunting smaller game, tending the growing crops. Fall was harvest time, but also when deer and bear hunting intensified as animals fattened for winter. Winter was the season of storytelling, of craft work, of repairing tools and planning for the year ahead. Each season had its work, its ceremonies, its particular quality. Governance wasn't centralized in a single authority. Each village had its chief, selected based on merit, wisdom, and demonstrated ability to lead. Decisions that affected the whole community were made in council, with both men and women participating. Consensus was valued over majority rule. If significant opposition existed to a proposed action, more discussion was needed until a decision emerged that the community could support. This took time, but it created social cohesion and buy-in that authoritarian systems couldn't match. Trade networks connected Choctaw villages to a vast continental exchange system. Shell beads from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes region, stone tools from specific quarries hundreds of miles away. All of these moved through established routes. But trade wasn't just economic, it was diplomatic, social, spiritual. Traders carried news, songs, stories. They arranged marriages between distant communities. They were ambassadors as much as merchants. Children weren't isolated from adult life, but participated in it from an early age. They learned by watching and doing, gradually taking on more complex tasks as their skills developed. A girl would help her mother in the fields, learning not just how to plant and harvest, but the songs and stories associated with each crop, the ceremonies that ensured good yields, the social relationships that made agriculture a community endeavor. A boy would accompany his uncles on hunting trips, learning to track, to read the forest, to show respect to the animals he would one day hunt himself. Discipline wasn't harsh or punitive. Children were taught through example, through stories that illustrated consequences, through gentle correction rather than punishment. The goal wasn't obedience, but the development of character, of good judgment, of the ability to live in harmony with others. This required patience, but it produced adults who understood why certain behaviors mattered, not just adults who followed rules out of fear. This was the world that the Choctaw had built over thousands of years. Not perfect, not utopian, but functional, sustainable, and deeply rooted in both the physical landscape and a complex web of relationships and meanings. It was a civilization as sophisticated as any in the world, adapted exquisitely to its environment and capable of providing for its people while maintaining spiritual and social cohesion across generations. And it was all about to be tested in ways that no one could have imagined. The Choctaw language belongs to the Muskogean language family, and it's unlike any European language in structure and logic. It's polysynthetic, meaning that what English expresses in an entire sentence, Choctaw can express in a single complex word. Prefixes, suffixes, infixes, all combine to create words that carry tremendous amounts of information in compact form. This isn't primitive or simple. It's an entirely different way of organizing thought and communication. Take the word habinachi, which means, "it is raining." But it's not just stating a fact. The structure of the word can be modified to indicate whether it just started raining, has been raining for a while, is expected to continue, is the kind of rain that comes with thunder, or is a soft mist. The language encodes information about duration, intensity, and expectation in the verb form itself. This gives Choctaw speakers a precision in describing natural phenomena that English can barely approximate without long, awkward descriptions. The language also makes distinctions that English doesn't. There are different verb forms depending on whether you personally witnessed something, heard about it from someone else, or are reporting traditional knowledge. This builds epistemological precision directly into the grammar. When someone speaks Choctaw, their listeners know not just what is being said, but the source of that knowledge, its reliability, its context. This was crucial in a culture based on oral tradition, where distinguishing between eyewitness account, hearsay, and sacred story was essential. During World War I, the United States military discovered that the Choctaw language had an unexpected military application. In October 1918, members of the 36th Infantry Division, including several Choctaw soldiers, were deployed in France. The Germans had been successfully intercepting and decoding American communications, but they had no way to understand Choctaw. The language was so different from any Indo-European language that it was effectively an unbreakable code. Choctaw Code Talkers transmitted messages that helped coordinate American attacks during the final months of the war. The Germans never broke the code because it wasn't a code at all. It was simply a language so structurally different from anything they knew that they couldn't even identify patterns to begin decryption. This was the first use of Native American languages in military communications, predating the more famous Navajo Code Talkers of World War II by more than 2 decades. But the survival of the Choctaw language into the 20th century was far from guaranteed. Federal policies, beginning in the late 1800s and continuing into the 1970s, actively suppressed Native languages. Children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where speaking anything but English was forbidden and punished. The goal was explicit: to kill the Indian and save the man, to erase Native identity and assimilate indigenous people into mainstream American culture. Many languages didn't survive this assault. Of the hundreds of Native American languages spoken before European contact, less than half remain, and many of those are spoken only by elders. But Choctaw persisted. Grandparents taught it to grandchildren in secret. Communities held onto it as an act of resistance, of cultural preservation, of identity maintenance. The language became not just a means of communication, but a symbol of survival itself. Today, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, and the Jena Band of Choctaw Indians all have active language preservation programs. These aren't just token gestures. They're serious, well-funded initiatives that include immersion schools where children learn Choctaw as their first language, language classes for adults, mobile apps and online resources, master apprentice programs pairing fluent elders with younger learners. The goal is ambitious: to create a new generation of fluent speakers who will carry the language into the 22nd century. Why does this matter? Because language isn't just words. It's a way of thinking, a framework for understanding the world, a repository of cultural knowledge that can't be fully translated into another language. When you lose a language, you lose unique perspectives on human experience, particular ways of categorizing reality, specific knowledge about relationships between humans and the natural world. The Choctaw language contains ecological knowledge, social wisdom, spiritual understanding accumulated over millennia. Preserving it isn't nostalgia, it's preserving irreplaceable human knowledge. Choctaw artistic traditions transform humble materials into powerful statements of identity and beauty. River cane basket weaving, perhaps the most iconic Choctaw art form, turns a simple grass into intricate, durable containers that are both functional and beautiful. The techniques are ancient, passed from master weavers to apprentices through demonstration and practice, each generation adding its own innovations while preserving core methods. The process begins with harvesting river cane at the right time of year, when the plant's moisture content is optimal. The cane is split into thin strips, and these strips are then woven into complex patterns using techniques like double weaving that create structure without any framework. The patterns aren't arbitrary. They carry meaning, telling stories, marking clan affiliations, representing natural phenomena. A basket isn't just a container. It's a text, readable by those who know the language of pattern and form. The dyes used to color the cane strips come from natural sources. Walnut hulls create rich browns. Bloodroot produces reds. Butternut yields yellows. Each dye plant must be gathered at the right time, prepared correctly, and applied with knowledge born of experience. The colors aren't just decoration, they're part of the basket's meaning, adding layers of symbolism to the geometric patterns. A basket might represent a specific story, commemorate an event, or serve as a form of prayer. Beadwork is another art form where Choctaw artists excel. Before European contact, beads were made from shells, bone, seeds, and stone. With the arrival of European glass beads through trade, Choctaw beadwork exploded into new forms of expression. But the patterns, the symbolic content, the aesthetic principles remained rooted in Choctaw tradition. Beadwork adorned clothing, especially ceremonial dress, but also items like bags, belts, and cradle boards. Pottery, while less central to historic Choctaw culture than to some southwestern tribes, was still an important craft. Pots were coiled by hand, smoothed with river pebbles, and fired in open pits. The shapes were functional but elegant, designed for specific purposes like cooking, storage, or carrying water. Surface treatments included engraving and stamping, creating textures that were both decorative and helped with gripping wet vessels. Each potter developed a distinctive style, identifiable to those familiar with the work. What all these art forms share is that they're not separated from daily life. There's no museum culture, no division between fine art and craft, between aesthetic objects and functional tools. A beautifully woven basket is meant to be used. Beaded clothing is meant to be worn. Art is integrated into life, making the ordinary beautiful, the functional meaningful. This is a fundamentally different relationship to aesthetics than the European tradition of art as something separate, something hung on walls or placed on pedestals. Contemporary Choctaw artists continue these traditions while also working in new media. There are Choctaw painters, sculptors, photographers, filmmakers, digital artists. They engage with both traditional themes and contemporary Indigenous experiences, creating work that speaks to Choctaw identity in the 21st century. This isn't abandoning tradition. It's tradition evolving, adapting, remaining relevant to new generations while maintaining connection to ancestral knowledge and values. The revival of traditional arts has been an important part of cultural preservation efforts. Elders who learned basket weaving or beadwork as children are teaching these skills to young people. Cultural centers offer workshops. Schools incorporate traditional arts into their curricula. This isn't just about preserving techniques, it's about maintaining the worldview embedded in those techniques, the patience, the attention to natural materials, the sense of connection to ancestors who worked with the same materials in the same ways centuries ago. Choctaw social structure was built on the principle of balance and reciprocity. The matrilineal clan system meant that identity, property, and social position passed through the mother's line. Children belonged to their mother's clan, not their father's. This gave women significant authority and ensured that family relationships were clear and unambiguous. Your mother's brothers were your primary male role models, more important in some ways than your biological father. This system also regulated marriage. You couldn't marry someone from your own clan, which prevented inbreeding and created connections between different clan groups. Marriage wasn't just a union of two individuals, but an alliance between families and clans, creating networks of mutual obligation and support that strengthened the entire community. These kinship networks were the foundation of Choctaw political and economic life. Stickball, or capuchatoli in Choctaw, was far more than recreation. It was called the little brother of war because it served some of the same functions as warfare. Disputes between communities could be settled with a stickball game instead of bloodshed. Young men proved their courage and skill. The entire community gathered, betting on outcomes, cementing social bonds. Games were played on fields sometimes stretching a mile or more, with goals at each end and rules that allowed for considerable physical contact. Each player carried 2 sticks, each with a small net at the end, and the goal was to catch the ball and carry or throw it to score at the opposing goal. The athleticism required was extraordinary. Games could last hours or even days, with dozens of players on each side. Injuries were common, even expected. But the game served a purpose beyond sport. It channeled aggression into a structured format. It created heroes and stories. It maintained community identity and pride. The Choctaw approach to justice and conflict resolution emphasized restoration over punishment. If someone caused harm, the focus wasn't on making them suffer in return, but on repairing the damage and restoring social harmony. This might mean material compensation, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or ritual actions designed to cleanse and heal. The goal was to return everyone involved to right relationship with the community. Serious crimes, particularly murder, were handled differently. The victim's clan had the right to demand a life for a life, creating blood vengeance obligations that could last generations. But even here, alternatives existed. Compensation could be negotiated. Adoption into the victim's clan could replace the lost person. The point wasn't abstract justice, but maintaining balance, ensuring that clans remained equal in strength and status, that no group became too weak or too powerful relative to others. Leadership was earned, not inherited. Chiefs rose to prominence through demonstrated wisdom, generosity, speaking ability, and success in war or negotiation. But their power was limited. They couldn't command, only persuade. They led by example and consensus building. A chief who lost the confidence of his people simply stopped being followed. This created accountability without formal institutions, leadership responsive to community needs and values. The green corn ceremony marked the high point of the Choctaw ceremonial calendar. Held when the corn ripened in late summer, it was simultaneously a harvest celebration, a New Year festival, and a spiritual renewal. The ceremony lasted several days and included fasting, purification rituals, the lighting of a new sacred fire, feasting, dancing, and the resolution of disputes. It was a time when the community renewed itself, leaving behind old grudges and starting fresh. The ceremony began with fasting and the extinguishing of all fires in the village. This symbolic death of the old year cleared space for renewal. Spiritual leaders prepared medicines, performed purification rituals, and kindled a new sacred fire using traditional methods. From this central fire, every household rekindled their own hearths, symbolically participating in the communal renewal. The new fire represented new beginnings, forgiveness, the cycles of death and rebirth that governed all existence. Dancing was central to Choctaw ceremonial life. The stomp dance, performed in a spiral pattern around the fire, created community through synchronized movement and sound. Women wore turtle shell shackles filled with pebbles that created rhythm as they danced. Men chanted and sang, their voices rising and falling in patterns passed down through generations. The dance could continue for hours, participants entering trance states, connecting with spirits, experiencing unity with ancestors and with each other. Music wasn't separated from the rest of life, but woven throughout it. There were songs for planting and harvest, songs for hunting, songs for healing, songs for mourning, songs for celebration. Many were ancient, their origins lost in time. Others were composed by individuals who received them in dreams or visions. Songs carried power. The right song could heal illness, ensure success in hunting, protect travelers, attract love. They were treated with respect, performed only in appropriate contexts by those with the right to sing them. Knowledge transfer happened through these ceremonies and through daily interaction between elders and youth. There were no schools in the European sense, but education was constant and comprehensive. Children learned by listening, watching, practicing. They heard the stories that encoded history, ethics, and practical knowledge. They participated in ceremonies, gradually taking on more complex roles as they matured. They accompanied adults in daily work, learning skills through apprenticeship and imitation. This educational system was remarkably effective at preserving and transmitting complex knowledge across generations. Without writing, the Choctaw maintained detailed historical knowledge, sophisticated understanding of ecology and agriculture. intricate ceremonial procedures, and nuanced social and ethical principles. The oral tradition, combined with practical demonstration and participatory learning, created cultural continuity that lasted thousands of years, until it was deliberately attacked and nearly destroyed. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. The stated purpose was to exchange native lands in the eastern United States for territory west of the Mississippi River. The real purpose was to seize millions of acres of fertile land coveted by white settlers and open it to cotton cultivation and slavery expansion. The act specifically targeted the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, who occupied prime agricultural land in the Southeast. The Choctaw were the first major tribe forced to relocate under this law. In September 1830, just months after the act passed, Choctaw leaders were pressured to sign the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in Mississippi. The treaty ceded over 11 million acres of Choctaw land in exchange for land in Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. The negotiation was coercive, conducted under threats and false promises, with alcohol flowing freely to cloud judgment. Some Choctaw leaders recognized they had no real choice. The federal government would take the land one way or another. At least a treaty might preserve some rights, some compensation, some possibility of survival as a people. Others refused to accept the inevitability of removal and argued for resistance. But the political and military realities were overwhelming. The Choctaw could not win a war against the United States. The best they could hope for was to negotiate the terms of their own dispossession. The treaty included provisions allowing individual Choctaw families to remain in Mississippi if they claimed specific allotments and agreed to live under state law. But these provisions were systematically undermined. White speculators used fraud, intimidation, and legal manipulation to seize allotments. State authorities refused to protect Choctaw rights. Of the thousands who initially planned to stay, only a few thousand ultimately remained in Mississippi, becoming the ancestors of the modern Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. The removal itself began in the fall of 1831 and continued in waves through 1833. The Choctaw called it the Trail of Tears and Death, a name later applied to Cherokee removal as well. The federal government was supposed to provide food, transportation, clothing, and protection during the journey. Instead, the removal was characterized by incompetence, corruption, and callous indifference to human suffering. Contractors pocketed money meant for supplies. Officials prioritized speed and cost-cutting over the welfare of those being removed. The first group left in the fall of 1831, about 4,000 people making the journey westward. Winter arrived early and brutal. Freezing rain turned roads to mud. Rivers flooded. The supplies promised by the government never materialized or arrived spoiled and inadequate. People walked hundreds of miles, many without adequate clothing or shoes. The elderly and children suffered especially. Disease spread through the traveling groups, cholera and exposure killing dozens every week. One missionary traveling with the Choctaw wrote of seeing the road lined with the sick and dying, people too weak to continue abandoned by the side of the trail. He described children crying for parents who had died days before, elderly people collapsing in the mud, families burying loved ones in shallow graves marked only by piled stones. The government agents supervising the removal seemed immune to the suffering, focused only on moving the groups forward according to schedule. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 Choctaw died during removal and in the first difficult years in Indian Territory. That's somewhere between 15 and 30% of the entire nation. Entire families were wiped out. Whole clans lost their elders, their knowledge keepers, their connection to the old ways. The trauma of removal rippled through Choctaw society for generations, a wound that never fully healed. But even in the midst of this horror, the Choctaw demonstrated extraordinary compassion. In 1847, just over a decade after their own forced removal, the Choctaw Nation learned of the Irish potato famine. Despite being impoverished themselves, still struggling to rebuild their lives in Indian Territory, the Choctaw collected $170, a substantial sum at the time, and sent it to Ireland for famine relief. This act of generosity from a people who had so little, who had suffered so much, is one of the most remarkable examples of human empathy in history. The Irish never forgot. In 2017, Irish President Michael Higgins visited the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma to honor that 1847 donation. In 2018, a sculpture titled Kindred Spirits was erected in County Cork, Ireland, commemorating the Choctaw gift. And during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Irish people donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to Navajo and Hopi relief funds, explicitly citing the Choctaw gesture as their inspiration. Across almost 2 centuries, an act of compassion created a bond that endures. The removal fundamentally transformed Choctaw society. The land they left behind wasn't just property. It was sacred geography, every hill and river carrying stories, ancestors buried in mounds their people had built, plants and animals they had relationships with, stretching back millennia. Moving to Indian Territory meant severing those connections, trying to rebuild not just a government and economy, but an entire way of life in a foreign landscape, among sometimes hostile neighboring tribes. When the Choctaw arrived in Indian Territory, they found themselves in a very different environment from the southeastern woodlands they had left. The eastern part of their new territory was similar to their homeland, with forests and rivers. But moving west, the land became prairie, then near desert. New plants, new animals, new weather patterns. They had to learn this landscape, develop new relationships with it, figure out what would grow, where settlements made sense, how to survive in this unfamiliar place. Despite the trauma of removal, the Choctaw began rebuilding with remarkable speed and determination. By the late 1830s, they had established a constitutional government modeled partly on the United States system, but incorporating traditional Choctaw governance principles. They created a bicameral legislature, an executive branch headed by a principal chief, and a judicial system. This wasn't blind imitation of American institutions, but a creative adaptation, blending old and new to create something distinctly Choctaw. Education became a priority. The Choctaw established schools throughout their territory, eventually creating a comprehensive public education system that was in some ways more advanced than those in neighboring states. By the 1850s, the Choctaw Nation had a higher literacy rate than the white populations of surrounding areas. Schools taught both English and Choctaw, preserving language while providing access to the dominant culture's knowledge and systems. The economy developed rapidly. Choctaw farmers adapted their agricultural practices to the new environment, growing corn, wheat, and cotton. They raised cattle and hogs. Businesses emerged: blacksmith shops, mills, trading posts, newspapers. The Choctaw Telegraph began publication in the 1840s, printing in both English and Choctaw. By the time of the Civil War, the Choctaw Nation had rebuilt much of what they lost, creating a functioning society with its own institutions, economy, and culture. But the Civil War brought new devastation. The Choctaw Nation, like other tribes in Indian Territory, was pressured to ally with the Confederacy. Geography and economics played a role, surrounded as they were by Confederate states, and with an economy partly based on cotton and, in some cases, slavery that had been adopted from neighboring white society. Some Choctaw owned enslaved people, a tragic adaptation to the Southern economic system that surrounded them. The war ravaged Indian Territory. Armies from both sides moved through, requisitioning supplies, burning homes, destroying crops. Choctaw men fought and died on battlefields far from home. And when the Confederacy lost, the tribes that had allied with it faced collective punishment. The federal government forced new treaties that ceded land, granted railroads rights of way through tribal territory, and imposed new restrictions on tribal sovereignty. The Choctaw had rebuilt once after removal. Now they had to rebuild again after the war. The late 19th century brought new pressures. white settlers increasingly encroached on Indian territory, demanding that tribal lands be open to homesteading. The railroads wanted access. Corporations wanted timber, coal, oil. The federal government, which had promised that Indian territory would be permanent tribal land, began discussing dissolving tribal governments and allotting tribal land to individual owners, with surplus land open to white settlement. The Dawes Act of 1887 initiated the allotment process, and it was eventually imposed on Indian Territory tribes, including the Choctaw, in the early 1900s. The policy was presented as a way to help Indians by giving them individual ownership of land, teaching them to be independent farmers. The reality was that it was designed to break up tribal land holdings and open native land to white ownership. Every Choctaw citizen received an allotment of land. Everything left over was declared surplus and open to white settlement. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Many Choctaw allottees were defrauded out of their land through legal manipulation, fraud, or coercion. Others lost land because they couldn't pay taxes, a concept foreign to traditional Choctaw landholding. Within a generation, the vast majority of Choctaw land had passed into white ownership. The communal land base that had supported Choctaw society was shattered. And with Oklahoma statehood in 1907, tribal governments were dissolved, their courts abolished, their authority eliminated. For most of the early 20th century, the Choctaw Nation existed in a kind of legal limbo. There was no functioning tribal government. The principal chief was appointed by the President of the United States, not elected by Choctaw citizens, and had almost no real authority. The tribe owned almost no land. Federal policies aimed explicitly at assimilation, at erasing Native identity and absorbing Native people into the American mainstream. The goal, stated openly by government officials, was to make the Indian problem disappear by making Indians disappear. The boarding school system, which had begun in the late 1800s, continued and intensified. Choctaw children were taken from their families and sent to schools where their hair was cut, their names changed, their language forbidden. They were punished for speaking Choctaw, for practicing traditional religion, for anything that marked them as Indian. The trauma inflicted by these schools reverberates through Choctaw families to this day. Multiple generations lost connection to language, culture, and traditional knowledge. Meanwhile, those Choctaw who had remained in Mississippi faced different but equally severe challenges. They had no federal recognition, no reservation, no tribal government. They lived as an impoverished minority in one of the poorest states in the nation, subject to Jim Crow laws that treated them as non-white and therefore denied them basic rights. They survived through subsistence farming, occasional wage labor, and sheer determination to maintain their identity despite having almost nothing to sustain it. In Louisiana, a small Choctaw community maintained its identity in isolation, largely forgotten by both the federal government and the larger Choctaw community. They spoke Choctaw, maintained some traditional practices, and held onto their identity even without formal recognition or support. Their persistence in the face of poverty, discrimination, and neglect is testament to the power of cultural identity and community bonds. The turning point came in the 1970s. A combination of factors, including the civil rights movement, growing Native American activism, and changing federal policies, created space for tribal resurgence. In 1970, Congress passed legislation allowing the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma to elect its own chief for the first time in more than 60 years. That election, and the rebuilding that followed, marks the beginning of the modern era of Choctaw self-determination. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians gained federal recognition in 1945, but it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that they began to build the infrastructure of tribal government and economic development. Starting with almost nothing, they created manufacturing facilities, created jobs, built schools, established healthcare systems. Today, the Mississippi Choctaw are one of the largest employers in their region, a remarkable reversal of fortune achieved through strategic planning and hard work. The Jena Band of Choctaw Indians in Louisiana finally gained federal recognition in 1995. after decades of advocacy. Recognition meant access to federal services, the ability to exercise sovereignty, and formal acknowledgement of their existence and rights. It was the culmination of generations of struggle to maintain identity and achieve justice. Today, the 3 federally recognized Choctaw tribes collectively have over 200,000 citizens. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma is the 3rd largest tribe in the United States. They operate healthcare systems, schools, housing programs, cultural centers, museums, and economic enterprises ranging from manufacturing to gaming to technology. They are major employers in their regions, contributing billions of dollars to local and state economies while providing services to their citizens. But the resurgence isn't just economic or political, it's cultural. Language programs are revitalizing Choctaw, creating new speakers and reversing decades of decline. Cultural centers teach traditional arts, from basket weaving to beadwork to pottery. Elders work with young people to pass on stories, songs, and ceremonial knowledge. Stickball has been revived, with teams competing in tournaments that draw thousands of spectators. The Choctaw are not just surviving, they are thriving, reclaiming their heritage while engaging fully with the modern world. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma has invested heavily in education, offering scholarships and support to Choctaw students from elementary school through graduate programs. They've built a world-class cultural center that houses artifacts, archives, and educational programs. They've purchased land, rebuilding the land base that was lost during allotment. They exercise sovereignty in areas like taxation, law enforcement, and resource management, functioning in many ways like a state within a state. The Mississippi Band operates one of the most successful tribal economies in the country, with manufacturing facilities producing components for major corporations, gaming operations that draw visitors from across the region, and retail and service businesses. More importantly, they've maintained strong cultural cohesion, with most community members still speaking Choctaw and participating in traditional ceremonies and practices. They've managed to modernize economically while preserving cultural distinctiveness. Challenges remain, of course. Poverty persists in some Choctaw communities. Health disparities continue. The opioid epidemic has hit Native communities especially hard. Climate change threatens traditional plants and disrupts seasonal patterns that have guided Choctaw life for millennia. The struggle for sovereignty continues, with state and federal governments often challenging tribal authority. The work of healing historical trauma, of restoring what was broken, continues across generations. But the trajectory is clear. The Choctaw are not vanishing. They are not relics of a dead past. They are a living people with deep roots and forward vision, honoring their ancestors while building a future. They have survived colonization, removal, cultural genocide, and systematic dispossession. And they have not just survived, but found ways to thrive, to maintain identity, to contribute to the wider world while remaining distinctly and proudly Choctaw. The story of the Choctaw is ultimately a story about resilience, about the human capacity to endure and adapt without surrendering essential identity. From emergence through the Mother Mound to building magnificent earthen pyramids, from developing a sophisticated language to creating art that transforms simple materials into profound statements, from surviving the Trail of Tears to building thriving modern communities, the Choctaw journey encompasses some of the highest achievements and darkest tragedies of human experience. What can we learn from this story? That culture is more than museums and history books. It's living knowledge, passed from generation to generation, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining core values and identity. That resilience isn't just bouncing back, but growing stronger through adversity. That small acts of compassion, like the Choctaw donation to Irish famine relief, can create connections that span centuries and continents. That sovereignty matters, that peoples have the right to determine their own futures, to govern themselves, to preserve their languages and traditions. The Choctaw today are writing new chapters in their ancient story. Young Choctaw artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians are creating work that engages with both tradition and contemporary life. Choctaw scholars are researching and teaching their own history from Choctaw perspectives. Choctaw leaders are navigating complex political landscapes, protecting sovereignty, building economies, providing for their citizens. And ordinary Choctaw people are living their lives, raising families, maintaining connections to community and culture, ensuring that the chain of generations continues unbroken. If this story moved you, if you learned something, if you gained new respect for the Choctaw people and their incredible journey, then share this video. Help spread knowledge about Indigenous history and contemporary Indigenous peoples. And consider subscribing to this channel for more deep dives into cultures, histories, and stories that deserve to be more widely known. The Choctaw emerged from darkness into light, according to their origin story. They've made that journey many times since, literally and metaphorically, always finding their way through, always maintaining the essential core of who they are. Their story isn't over. It continues every day in every Choctaw person who speaks the language, practices the traditions, honors the ancestors, and builds the future. The people of the Mother Mound endure. And that in itself is a victory worth celebrating. Thank you for taking this journey through Choctaw history and culture. May we all learn from their example of resilience, their commitment to community, their respect for heritage, and their courage in facing the future. Yakoke. Thank you in Choctaw. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep honoring the diverse tapestry of human experience that makes our world so rich.